Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among this week's news items, we have for you an update on the efficacy of the bivalent vaccine versus the monovalent vaccine that has been used for COVID-19 so far. Something of a response to the claimed side effects of being vaccinated and how most of the videos that have become viral are really not a good indication that they are at all related to being vaccinated. The results of going to see a chiropractor and, for lack of a better word, case study on why you should not see a chiropractor. The reality that we do not have a cure for type 1 diabetes, and the stupid conspiracy theory that says Big Pharma is hiding the cure. No, it's not. A rather disturbing and very Terminator-like robot that can liquefy and reform into its shape, and the idea of shooting spacecraft in space in order to get them to travel further and faster. Let's start with the results of the bivalent vaccine. The bivalent vaccine is basically an update. The idea is that it's going to have the various antigens for both the BA4 and the BA5 variants of Omicron. This is basically the most recent version of the COVID-19 virus that we've dealt with, that we've been able to develop a vaccine for. By having both of the variants included in it, you get a better and more comprehensive immunological response. The results themselves are pretty compelling, but it is worth knowing up front that unfortunately they weren't able to study the bivalent vaccine against the monovalent. When the bivalent vaccine became available, the FDA pulled approval for the monovalent. This means that they had to go with another option. That other option was to study the previous nearly 100 days of data for the monovalent vaccine, and then 100 days of data for the bivalent vaccine, and see how the two overlapped. Because we're talking about two different time frames, this does create other problems. The first and simplest of which is that for the monovalent, there were just under 300,000 people who were on that list, and there were over 1 million people on the bivalent list. You also need to consider that in the same time frame we had new variants of COVID-19 emerging. So these are all problems as they stand. But the results themselves, as mentioned, are quite promising. The vaccine gave enough protection that it dropped the severity of hospitalizations down to 25%, that for the bivalent it was nearly 60%. So the bivalent versus monovalent has a more than double efficacy. Efficacy versus severe symptoms or severe infection was just under 25% for the monovalent and 62% for bivalent. So again, more than a doubling of efficacy. And this is not what should be expected, but the results are expected. Just because you put two sets of antigens in there doesn't mean you'll get twice as much efficacy. It just means that you have a better chance of being able to match with something coming up. And it is very much a numbers game. It's why the trivalent, quadrivalent, and similar levels of multivalent influenza vaccines are used, although typically only the trivalent is available and you need to pay for the quadrivalent. There were two studies though this week. The first looked at that, and then the second looked at whether or not the vaccines, particularly the bivalent vaccine, provided protection from the XBB and XBB 1.5 viruses. These are the most recent strains that are proving to be particularly virulent. The results themselves are only 2 weeks old or thereabouts at this stage. It did find similar results again though. It found that against the newest variants, if you had the bivalent vaccine given to you, or even the monovalent vaccine given to you, there was a 49% efficacy for symptoms, and that is symptomatic infection. The rates did go down slightly for old individuals between 50 and 64, where it was 40%. Against the original strain, or BA5, it was 43%, so you've lost approximately 3% protection there. The reality is that this isn't all that surprising. The older you get, the worse your chances of being able to fend off some sort of infection become. And this was true again for those over 65, where for the original strains it was 43%, and against the newer strains it was 37%. So you can see how this really isn't much different to what we already know about vaccines for things like influenza and how influenza plays out. There was one other element to this that is particularly noteworthy though. If you had an updated booster, and that was the most recent booster available, you had a 13-fold reduction in chances of dying compared to being unvaccinated. That means that those who have at least been vaccinated have some protection, those who have an up-to-date booster are most protected, and those who are unvaccinated have almost no protection. The best protection was from the bivalent vaccine, but the monovalent also had about half the efficacy of the bivalent vaccine, so you aren't getting as good protection, but you are getting protection. Now on to debunking news of viral videos, and specifically 3 videos, although really only 2 since 2 of them are of the same individual, showing basically the same symptoms. The claim is that if you get the COVID-19 vaccine, regardless of which one it is, the chances are you will have nasty side effects. This is not necessarily true. Yes, there are 4 noteworthy instances where you could possibly, with a very low chance, have side effects that are nasty. These being anaphylaxis, and chances are you're already well aware of the risk of anaphylaxis from a vaccine, and that you are taking appropriate cautions. Thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, a myocarditis or pericarditis, and Guillain-Barré syndrome. These are 4 that are a concern. As we mentioned, the first you would already be aware of if you know of your own allergies. The next 3 are a different story, as each of them is generally related to a different kind of vaccine. The Guillain-Barré syndrome symptom is really only associated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, so if you have an mRNA-based vaccine, no, you don't need to worry. The thrombosis with thrombocytopenia was only associated with the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines, not mRNA vaccines. With that, we've taken away 3 of the most serious side effects, leaving only myocarditis or pericarditis, which, to be blunt, you have a much higher risk of if you get infected with COVID-19, which means being vaccinated is the infinitely safer option. This is where the videos come into play. The 2 videos are basically of Angelia Dessel and Sean Skelton. As the article describes, they basically seem to show a movement disorder, and most likely, at least the first case, a movement disorder caused by psychiatric illnesses. So, not psychiatric in terms of being mentally ill, but something that's wrong with them in terms of their mind, like stress, causing something very similar to a tic or similar sort of phenomena. That means that their internal mental state is being exhibited in external muscle motions. The Sean Skelton video is also similar, although the questions there are more serious, as there's also the possibility that they may well be engaged in some sort of seizure, and that's an entirely different matter, and there's almost no relationship to the COVID-19 vaccines. The only possible, let's say, relationship could be that due to an immunological reaction leading to extreme fever, the brain itself is basically on fire, and that's what's causing a seizure. But you would have a much better idea of that because you wouldn't be able to record it. You would basically be burning up, and you would have been rushed to a hospital. The other noteworthy part to this is that, as we've put forward in a past video, anecdotes like this are not evidence. Relying on them as proof of something isn't how things work. They're not data. They are anecdotes, and anecdotes should not be relied on because they are very subjective. People will only apply what they think is relevant, and, importantly, you will have an extreme opinion one way or the other. Either the vaccines will have provided you with perfect protection, or they'll have done nothing, and so you wind up having those extremes. Those who have experienced nothing at all, or in the middle, may not ever have a thought or a feeling about it one way or the other, and as such, never make an anecdote. In further health-related news, but moving from COVID-19 to HIV, but it's more than just HIV. It relates to Tennessee and how they've rejected federal funding for health services, partially because the millions of dollars from the federal government was going partly into HIV and AIDS prevention, but that the money was being distributed through various organizations that the government seems to have disagreed with, or at least that's how the article presents it. The problem here is simple. Not everything is necessarily related to that. Part of it is certainly true that they are trying to avoid funding things like Planned Parenthood, but at the same time, other elements of this, such as claiming it's racism, sexism, or some other istophobia, isn't necessarily the case. That's because the state will continue to provide support with regards to HIV testing and prevention, but it'll be going through first responders, victims of human trafficking, for mothers and children, rather than programs aimed at men who have sex with men, transgender people, and communities of colour. The reason the federal government focuses on these groups rather than a alternative approach is that those groups tend to have more risk, or at least that's what the data would indicate. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are the only group at risk though, and this is the problem here. The way it's being presented is not necessarily the whole story, but it's certainly an element to it. This is also further emphasizing the importance that it's not necessarily an effort to undermine any particular group. The problem the state will face is simple. Tennessee's likely to see what other states have seen when they've done something similar, and that is there will be a significant increase in the number of HIV infections that are detected if they go through the right channels. Other states have tried this, such as Florida, and that's exactly what happened. And chances are it will keep happening if the state goes down this pathway. It's also important to note that theoretically, states should be able to act independently of federal funding and therefore get the federal funding without any strings attached to it telling them what they must do with that money. If they can implement it in a way that works and is effectively the same program that was already available, something that may theoretically be possible if Tennessee can find the $8.3 million they claim they'll be putting towards this from their own coffers versus getting the money from the federal government. Shifting from medical news that might be bad once we see it play out to medical news of a kind that definitely played out. A quack has cracked someone's neck, and they really are a crackpot for doing so. A young woman, 29 years old, went to a chiropractor, and this was because they were having neck pain. They already tried medical massage, but it didn't do the job. So they had a chiropractor try and fix their neck for them. In doing so, as is a significant and very pronounced risk with chiropractors, they caused damage to the arteries in their neck, leading to a stroke. This is not an unknown risk with chiropractors, and it's not to say there is no risk with any medical care, but chiropractors, especially if they're going to crack your neck, is especially high risk. The fact that her neck made very unpleasant cracking sounds in both directions, then she started throwing up and had to be taken to the hospital, was the first sign something had gone very wrong. Once they got her in a CT scan, they found that not only was she having a stroke, but that the chiropractor had torn an artery in the back of her neck, and this obviously prevents blood from going to her brain, hence the stroke diagnoses. They suspect she may have even had 2 strokes, the obvious primary stroke and possibly a mini stroke, which is what resulted in the difficulty with her legs and the weird feelings therein. We've included a link to a study of the risk of going to a chiropractor and the possible issues to do with stroke and similar in the description box below, so if you'd like more details, please look at that. Going from obvious medical news and concerns with that to medical news about bad application to what is ultimately simply a conspiracy theory. The idea that Big Pharma is hiding the cure to type 1 diabetes. The very proposition behind this is absolutely asinine. Type 1 diabetes, unlike type 2, is something that, for lack of a better description, you are practically born with. It will develop gradually over a series of years, but as a child, your body learns to identify that the insulin-producing beta cells in your pancreas are something that they need to attack and destroy. This happens progressively, and so you gradually have less and less insulin available in your body to be able to use glucose. Because of this, you eventually can no longer use glucose and you are now diabetic. Because you have lost the beta cells in your pancreas, you can never make insulin in your own body. This means no endogenous insulin. You must instead inject insulin from an outside source, whether it is synthetically made insulin, or as it was very, very long ago, sourced from animal pancreases. This is the challenge though, where type 2 diabetics have a pancreas and they've just become desensitized to insulin, or possibly aren't producing enough insulin. Type 1 diabetics don't have that option at all. The exact reason why the body identifies the pancreatic cells responsible for insulin production as foreign and needing to be destroyed is an unknown. How to fix that is an unknown. The best possible options at the minute are theoretically stem cell transplants that allow the replacement of those beta cells or the transplanting of beta cells themselves. But even that is not a perfect solution. This is why those treatments are currently in experimental stages or very early clinical trials. Now think of it this way, you've lost the means of producing the necessary insulin. You can get insulin and inject it, as long as you monitor your blood glucose levels. This means that at least for now, although uncomfortable, a solution does exist and it is available. Big Pharma is not hiding it. The issue is, though, how do you fix it and fix it internally so you no longer need to inject insulin? Well, if you have the answer to that, there may well be a Nobel Prize waiting for you, because nobody else does. And this is the reason why Big Pharma is not hiding the cure. That's because there is, for all intents and purposes, no cure available. To be blunt, the entire basis of this smacks of the same sort of rationale used for Big Pharma is hiding the cure to cancer. Why would they hide it? They can make money out of curing people with cancer. They can make money out of people being cured of diabetes. It's a ridiculous idea that they're burying it for the money. It's ridiculous that they're burying it because they don't want anyone else to know. Many of the rationales presented by many conspiracy nuts are just that, stupid and nutty. Going from somewhat medical related news to disturbing nature news, and how one of the giant carnivorous plants has instead involved a trait where it's effectively a toilet. Pitcher plants are readily recognized because, well, as the name suggests, they look like a pitcher or a very large jug. The idea is that an animal or insect would fall into them, get caught in some sort of watery environment, drown, and then decompose and turn into nutrients for the animal. The evolution in this case has forgone the need for the animal to die and instead simply leave its feces there. And this particular disconcerting niche in the environment has proven to be surprisingly effective. The animal gives more nitrogen to the plant, and therefore the plant can grow more because of it. There's less need for other difficulties. The reason this appears to work is that by focusing on feces, they have better access to nitrogen. More so, at least, compared to the carnivorous versions of the same sort of plant. And this would be particularly useful in soil that is nitrogen poor. Whether or not this would be useful in other environments is probably why we don't see the trait developing elsewhere. Bizarre plant behavior aside, we can go to bizarre robot behavior, and possibly the start of the Terminator movies. It's a robot, for lack of a better word, that can liquefy and then reform into its shape. The way it's done is by using a combination of magnets and gallium. Gallium is a very, very low melting point metal, somewhere just under 30 degrees Celsius. For those who insist upon using freedom units, it's somewhere around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, again, talking about a very low temperature, lower than body heat for that matter. By being able to switch between the molten gallium state and a solid state, it increases its functionality. The researchers show that this allows it to escape from a cage, which is something we've seen before, just in a very different context. The reason that they've made it from both gallium and magnetic material is that, first of all, the magnet acts as a way of heating up the gallium so that you don't need to apply heat externally, rather you apply energy that acts on the magnets. The second reason is that it provides the mobility and the ability to move, so you effectively remove all of the issues to do with using something like a robot by being able to control it externally with magnetic force or energy. The researchers think that this would be a particularly useful development for trying to get into small spaces where you realistically could not work otherwise, or for administering medication internal to the body or removing foreign material from the body. For example, consumed batteries, which are particularly notorious amongst very young children who view something small and round as being tasty, even if it's likely to cause them great harm. The final news item we have for you this week is a bit of astronomical news, although at this stage entirely theoretical. It's the idea of developing a laser that would allow you to fire small pellets at objects in space to send them away from Earth very quickly. Yeah, this sounds like it's going to start some sort of space war, but possibly not. Possibly. The idea is that they're going to get a 10 megawatt laser in space. They're going to use this to shoot out tiny pellets that are only a fraction of a gram or less. These tiny little things are going to be able to hit a 1-ton spacecraft and make it go really fast. We say really fast as it's estimated that the objects being pushed by a 10 megawatt laser, if it weighs 10 tons, could be accelerated up to about 30 astronomical units a year. Astronomical units are not quite the same, as it is roughly 150 million kilometers, or 8.3 light minutes, the amount of time it takes the sunlight from the sun to hit the Earth. That means a 1-ton spacecraft could travel between the sun and the Earth 30 times in 1 year. The idea is that you continue to hit the traveling object with these tiny pellets and impart momentum, and because in space there is relatively little to cause any reduction in speed, you are basically continuously adding to that momentum. That is why they think, in theory, anything using this sort of technology could get to somewhere around the area of Alpha Centauri in about 20 years. That is a ridiculous distance, and even spacecraft we sent into space in the 70s are still not anywhere near that point. And yet they think they could manage the same thing in 20 years using this technology. The reason why we've mentioned at the start of this particular item is that it's theoretical is that it only just received funding from NASA, about $175,000 in funding, and that will allow them to be able to test a lot of what they're trying to do with it going forwards. That's all the news we have for you this week. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.